Okay, so thank you very much, Sergei. So I would like to thank the organizer for inviting me in this very nice place and conference. My talk is mostly related to entanglement, so I will speak about entanglement starting from a sort of historical experiment that I did when I was the age of the students here about Bell's inequality test, and then move to more recent things. Okay, this was done in Institut d'Optique, which is my lab, so it's Institut of Optics, so we are close to Paris, so this is Paris. Eiffel Tower, and we are about 25 kilometers south from Paris. So the experiment I will describe, the old ones with Bell's inequalities, were done in the basement of this building, which was in Orsay. And in 2007, we moved to Palaiseau, and more recently, we are in this nice new building. So we are still Institut d'Optique, but now we are graduate school because you have to put English words everywhere. Okay, so the first part is sort of historical. I will sort of tell the story of Bell's inequality test. So as you know, it started with Einstein. So Einstein is clearly a founding father of quantum mechanics. His main contribution, among many one, but for quantum things, is the famous paper in 1905 about photons. It was not called photon, it was called Lichtquanten. But the idea that light is made of grain of energy, quanta, later named photons. So at the beginning, it was not accepted very well because Maxwell equations were working extremely well, so it was very surprising to have these little grains of energy. But finally, there were experiments by Millikan, who spent 10 years doing experiments. Everybody was convinced, and Einstein got the Nobel Prize in 21 for the photon, not for relativity, as you know. And Millikan also gets the Nobel Prize in 23. But, so Einstein also did special relativity, general relativity, but after this major starting contribution, he was never fully happy with quantum mechanics. And the very famous paper is this 35 paper with Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen, where they propose a definition of physical reality, and then they make a sort of reasoning, and they conclude that the quantum formalism is incomplete. There are some missing parts, that like if quantum mechanics was hiding something from us. So I will not tell more, I will come back to that later, but this paper immediately triggered a reaction by Niels Bohr. They never agreed, Einstein and Bohr, so it's a very famous debate who took a long time. Bohr said, no, it's quantum mechanics is not incomplete, it is complete. Quantum mechanics tells you everything you have to know, and there is nothing more to look for. So this was a little bit of philosophy, and then it was not so important because quantum mechanics was extremely successful. It explained matter, light interactions, transistor, lasers, etc. There was no disagreement on the validity of quantum prediction, so the debate was sort of philosophical. And it's lasted many, many years until John Bell came in 1964, and he was able to translate, more or less, most people agree he did that, to translate Einstein's idea in mathematical equations. And then it was quite interesting because it became possible to test experimentally a philosophical hypothesis, which is sort of very unusual. But this is what was done. So this idea is local realism. I will try to explain what it is. And then there was a motion to experiments, which were, many of these experiments were done, and I will tell you the story. So the basic scheme, so it's not the EPR scheme, it's a variant which was done by Bohm with a spin of photons. So the idea is always the same. You have a source which emits pairs of particles, let's say 2 photons, nu1, nu2. Photons are polarized, you know, they vibrate perpendicularly to the direction of propagation, and you can send them to polarizers. So for spins 1/2, it would be Stern-Gerlach magnets. For photons, it's polarizer. And then you get 2 outcomes, transmitted or deviated, that I call +1 or -1. And there is an orientation that you can adjust, which is A on this side and B on this side, and each particle is analyzed using such a polarizer. So the results are plus or minus here and plus or minus here. Okay, and so you are interested in probabilities. You emit some pairs, and you want the probability distribution to get plus or minus 1. So there are what is people call single probabilities. So depending on A, P plus or P minus on this side, on B, P plus or P minus on that time. But what is also very interesting are the joint probabilities for given A and B, what is P plus plus, P plus minus, minus plus, minus minus. So in principle, any theory should be able to, for a given source within a steady state, should be able to provide these probabilities. So let's look at quantum mechanics. So obviously, one has to look to use some special states. So we will use the famous entangled states. So they are written like that in quantum mechanics. So you see it's a strand state where both photons can be polarized like that, which is in my XX, or they can be polarized like that, which is YY, but you make a superposition. So it's not either, it's both. It's a quantum superposition of these things. Then you can calculate everything. And the P plus, etc., are all equal to 1/2, whatever you do. So it looks totally random. You can turn B or turn A as you want. On a given side, the result is always completely random. So it doesn't look like polarized light, because you get anything, whatever orientation you choose. But now these results are strongly correlated in the sense that, for instance, P plus plus will depend on A and B with a thing which is like that. So this is easy to calculate. Okay, so I will give more details. And you see that, for instance, if A equals B, then cosine is 1, and this one is 0. So P plus plus and minus minus are 1/2, and the other two are 0. So it means that if you get plus on one side, you will always get plus on the other side if the two orientations are the same. If they are not the same, it's different, but if they are the same, in any direction, both the same, you will get always plus plus or plus minus or minus minus, but never plus minus or minus plus. So this is 0. So this is called a correlation. They are strongly correlated because you get the same result on both sides. Okay, so now one can look at this. There is a mathematical way to express this correlation. So there are two random variables, which are plus or minus on both sides. So if you want the correlation function or covariance, you calculate the average value of the product of the results. So the products of the results, which are plus or minus, are plus or minus. And then the average product is P plus plus, plus minus minus, because it's minus minus makes plus here. And then here you have minus and minus. So it's also that. So you can calculate this correlation function of covariance of the result, which is given by this formula. So I sent an homework, so you just all received an homework. And if you never did this calculation, do it. It's worth doing it once in your life. And you get this result, sorry, for these probabilities and for the correlation functions. So, okay, so what can we conclude? So it's just quantum mechanics. So what can we conclude from that? So classically, one would conclude, obviously, that the two things are correlated. But it's not surprising to have correlation. You just take twins, for instance. Twins, both, if you have a boy and a girl, or two boys, whatever, who have the same parents and who are born together, they have similar genes, and therefore they will have, for instance, both blue eyes or both blonde hairs or whatever. So correlations do exist in classical physics. But the point in classical physics is that these correlations are carried by properties of the two objects. Two twins have the same look like each other because they have the same parents, and therefore they have the same genes, and they carry these genes with them. So this is the idea of local realism. This is the idea which was in sort of the head of Einstein, etc. If you see correlation, it means that these correlations are carried by properties of nu1 on one side and properties of nu2 on the other side. So this is a classical view of correlation, and this is what Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen wanted to implement. But quantum mechanics, as you said, does not tell that. Here, you cannot tell, it's a joint property. This is a global quantum state, and you cannot attribute properties to each of the objects. So this is this local realism hypothesis. Is there any way to understand this correlation with local properties of the photons? So let's try. So this is related to Bell's theorem. So this is John Bell. So I will just try to make it. So assume that these two photons, for instance, just have the same polarization. Since you find always the same result, the obvious explanation is that they may just have the same polarization. But this polarization is random. So from one pair to the other one, it will fluctuate, but two photons of a pair have always the same polarization. So we can do that. So assume that common direction of polarization that I call lambda, it's randomly distributed. You get results plus or minus 1, which depend on the angle of the polarizer. Now you make a little model like that. Given this lambda, if you are close to this side, you will get plus, and if you are close to this side, you will get minus. So you put a sign function here. So then you can calculate everything. The probabilities to get plus or minus are random, so it's just the same, it's fine. And the correlation function, so it was a cosine, you remember, this blue line. And this little model, which is very simple, gives us a red line, which is not so far. So one should expect that this model, very naive model, with properties of the photon, almost work. And then one may think also, let's try to round it a little bit, the red curve, and you will get to the blue curve. But the whole issue is that this is impossible to do. So this is Bell's theorem. It tells that whatever you do, you will never succeed to match the lines to the cosine square. So it means that no hidden variable theory, in the sense of what I just said, with some hidden lambda, can reproduce quantum mechanical predictions. So I just gave an example, but Bell's theorem is much, much more general. So it assumes almost nothing. So what does it assume? It assumes, as I said, that there are some lambdas, and given lambda, which are shared by the two photons of a pair, then you can compute plus or minus 1 given the orientation A. Same thing on the other side, and these lambda are randomly distributed. You don't have to tell what they are. There may be polarization, there may be anything of unknown. This is what they are called local hidden variables. Then, given this lambda, you can calculate my correlation function, the same thing as before, which is the average product of the results, A plus or minus 1, and you average over lambda with a distribution rho of lambda, which is normalized. That's it. That's almost nothing. There are a little trick, I will come back to that later. But if you just do that, which is the particle carry property, basically, then you are stuck. Because Bell has shown that if you combine 4 correlation functions for 2 angles on one side, 2 angles on the other side, you get this inequality. It takes one line to demonstrate, so it's also in the homework, so if you never did it, do it. It's really worth doing it. So you see you have 2 angles on each side. You can combine these quantities, and you can check quickly that this thing is either plus or minus 2, always. There are 4 things, so it might be plus or minus 4, but actually no, it's plus or minus 2. And then if you average it, you are stuck between plus 2 and minus 2. So that's it, it's a one-line demonstration. That's Bell's inequalities. And then if you compare with the quantum calculation, which was cosine, and if you choose these angles, you see that S quantum can reach 2 square root of 2, which is much beyond 2. So there is a conflict. So this very simple hypothesis don't fit with quantum mechanics. So this was done in 1964, a little bit after. So this form is the so-called CHSH, it's Clauser, Horn, Shimony, and Holt. It was 1969. And then after that, people try to do experiments. Before speaking about the experiment, there are a few subtle remarks. People usually tell local hidden variable. So why do you tell local? Because I assumed, I did not tell it, but I tell it now, that A on the A side does not depend on the orientation on the other side. Similarly, B does not depend on A, and rho does not depend on A and B. So rho is the way the particles are emitted. So the particles are emitted independently of the measurement you will do later. So this sounds quite reasonable because it sort of forbids, instantaneous influence at the distance. It's not by measuring this side, I should not do something on the other side due to relativity. So this can be enforced. So this was the idea of Alain Aspect in 1976. That is, instead of assuming that, if you can enforce it if you are able to switch the orientation, B or B prime, A or A prime, very fast. If you change that very fast, then due to relativity, it will be impossible for any signal to go back on the other side or to go back to the source. So it's considered very important in this experiment to do this fast random switching, which enforces the locality condition. And then if you don't accept to violate relativities, which nobody accepts, then you are stuck to use this hypothesis. So this sort of embeds conflict between quantum mechanics and Einstein worldview, which is local realism based on relativity. So you see there is local. Local is no instantaneous action at a distance. There is also realism, and I think realism, it has to be understood maybe not in a fully philosophical sense. The understanding of realism here is that the particles carry their own properties. If you have a property here, a particle here, you can define its properties. And this is classical realism. And globally, local realism will fail, as you will say. Okay, so yes, so I told about the switch. So then there were many experiments which were done. So it started, I think the proof, CHSH proof was 69. Then 72, there were experiments. The first one was John Clauser, who did absolutely fantastic experiment in 72. He found a violation of Bell's inequalities, good agreement with quantum mechanics, hundreds of hours of counting time, really a heroic experiment. Then there was another experiment given violating quantum mechanics in agreement with Bell's inequalities, and then some other, again with quantum mechanics. None of these experiments used this fast switch. So then we worked in assisted optics. So I started as a PhD student. I was your age, in end of the around 79. So the idea of Alain Aspect was to implement this fast switching. So we built a new sources with lasers, etc., much improved with respect to Clauser's one, and in order to make this switch. So I will show some result later. Then there were many more experiments, but this experiment sort of agreed with quantum mechanics. But there were still some so-called loopholes. They were not completely perfect. And finally, the best experiment ever were done quite recently. You see, almost 35 years later. And I will also tell you a word about that. So these were our old experiments. So this is what I started as a master student. So the idea was to excite calcium atoms here with two lasers, blue laser and a yellow laser. So you see the blue laser here and the yellow laser here. This is the yellow beam. And then the calcium atoms emit two photons. And due to the angular momentum conservation, the quantum state of these two photons is just the right one to violate Bell's inequalities. So you see the two photons are emitted in a vacuum chamber. So the calcium atoms are here. They fly vertically. They are hit by the lasers. And one photon goes the yellow photon goes in the yellow pipe, and the other one you see in these big pipes. They fly away at about 15 meters, and then we measure the polarization. So this is a laser-induced two-photon excitation of this atomic cascade, which produces a lot of pairs of photons, much more than Clauser had. So the experiment had a very good statistics very quickly. It was still, well, at this, this kind of gas laser, krypton ion laser, argon ion laser, you don't see that anymore in labs. They are completely obsolete, but there were no laser diodes at that time. Imagine in this time there was no internet, no smartphone, and no laser diodes. This is almost prehistoric. Also, this is a little bit prehistoric. This is the first polarizer we use. It's called a pie-of-plate polarizer. So you have many glass plates which are taken at Brewster angle. So at Brewster angle, it means the polarization which is in the plane of the screen goes straight, and the other one gets lost somewhere on one of these plates. And you have many plates so that you make sure that the bad photon is lost somewhere, you don't know where, and the other one is transmitted. So this was the pipes and the photon cursor, etc. So this is an aspect at that time. And so we had this ugly polarizer, but at the same time, it was a first appearance of multi-dielectric polarizer. Opticians now all use multi-dielectric polarizer, which are little cubes in glass. But in the 70s, it was quite exceptional. So Alain went to Amsterdam because he had a friend in Philips, and he smuggled big suitcase from Amsterdam to Paris. So in the 70s, big suitcase from Amsterdam to Paris most of the time was not containing polarizer cubes, but okay, he did it. And so this is a cube, and then this was used for new experiment, again, the vacuum chamber, the pipes, etc. So this is me at that time, and we were drinking a lot of coffee to do experiments by night. Okay, so this is the experiment with the polarizer cube. So again, the source, now we have photon counters, which make click, and then we just count photons. We have the source running, and we count photons. So either you get plus, plus, minus, minus, plus, minus, or minus, plus. You count all that. And then the correlation function is very simply obtained by putting minus, minus here over the sum of everything. So this experiment worked very well, super statistics. You see quantum mechanics prediction was 2.7. We got something like that, 2.7 blah blah. And it violated Bell's inequalities by 40 standard deviation in a few minutes. So it was really a very efficient experiment. But it's static. There is not a switch yet. This was a polarizer, for instance. The cube was in this box, and the photon counters. This is not APDs. You know, maybe opticians now use avalanche photodiodes, which are tiny devices. These were the big polarizers and big photomultipliers. The whole thing was doing exercise that rotating these polarizers. They were about 20 kilograms. Okay, so if you do the homework, you will calculate this curve, which is sort of the S value as a function of the angle. So the maximum valuation is here. This is 2.7, but you violate over a full range of angle, which is beyond Bell's limit here. And you see the statistics is plus or minus 2 standard deviation. So it's very efficient and very nice. So if you, again, this in my little exercise, homework, you do calculate this curve. This is easy, so if you don't do it once in your life. Okay, so now the big challenge was switches. So the idea, again, is to eliminate this possibility of communication between the two sides. So you see, and then the time of flight is 20 nanoseconds, 10 minus 9 seconds. So it's really, really short. You cannot move this big thing. So Alain's idea was to use switch. So you use a fast switch, and the switch sends the photon either to this polarizer along B or this polarizer along B prime. And if the switch is fast enough, faster than the time of travel of the light between the source and the switch, then you sort of satisfy this locality condition. You can exclude these things. I will discuss more later. So this was a trick. So you have to do this switch. So the switch was a little tank of water. It's in our museum. Now this is a tank. It's about that big. So it's filled with water. And you have transducer which make a standing wave. So, and it's a standing wave sometimes is here, sometimes it's not here. So when it's not here, it's just water. So the beam goes straight. And when it's here, there is diffraction. And all the beam is diffracted. It's a thick grating. And so it goes here. So now it's switching between here to there every 10 nanoseconds. So you see, it's a very sort of, it's not random actually, it's quasi-periodic, but the two sides are decorrelated. And then so you see in the box there is a switch, and it goes to two polarizers, which are in different orientations. So this experiment was much more difficult than the previous ones, because you had to fit in the switch, etc. So it took more time, reduced signal. We had to wait for several hours. But you know, Alain is from southwest of France. In southwest of France, we like very much foie gras, if you know. And Sauternes, a very good white wine, I recommend. So while the photons are coming, you can taste foie gras and Sauternes. That we did. Okay, and the switch was not fully random, but finally it worked very well. So again, the Bell's inequalities were violated by 6 standard deviation. So the measurements were space-like separated, which was the goal, and so Einstein causality enforced. So this was a sort of a premiere, which was done in 1982. So even trying to push quantum mechanics to the ultimate limit, you see that quantum mechanics wins, and again, Bell's inequalities are violated. So this experiment was nice, but then there were a lot of discussion about the so-called loopholes. So what are the loopholes? So the loopholes are simply defects which make that the experiment, the real experiment, does not exactly follow the hypothesis of Bell's theorem. So because reality is not like theory, and so there are little things which introduce gap, and if you have a logical gap in a proof, well, you can exploit this gap to violate inequalities in another way. So in order to avoid that, you do supplementary assumptions, which are ad hoc hypotheses, to avoid to go into the trap. So for instance, the locality loophole. So locality loophole is that you would like to have your measurements space-like separated. So if you do a static experiment, they are not space-like separated. So you can assume, okay, it might be like that. So it's a strong assumption. And if you want to avoid this, to do this assumption, you need this very fast switch. So this can be improved. Detection loophole is worse in some sense, because the idea here is that it's between, when you make a vote, you vote, everybody votes, you can replace the vote by a poll. You just take a small sample and ask to the small sample to vote for, and then you hope that it will be the same for the true result. And if you take our old experiment, for instance, you see that I make this ratio between this quantity and this quantity. This quantity are the number of detected pairs of photons. So it's the sum of all possibilities, which is the number of detected pairs. But now, a photon which is emitted here, the other one can go anywhere. And most of emitting photons are actually not detected. So if you calculate the ratio between the number of detected pairs and the number of emitted pairs, it's 10 minus 6, which means that only 1 over 1 million of the emitted pairs is detected. So as a vote is not good at all. We would like everybody to vote. And so there is a threshold. You would like this thing to be at least 0.8, and now it's 10 minus 6. So this is a loophole. And this one was hard to fix, but as we'll show, it was finally fixed. So a lot of pairs are missing. And so you need a trick to have sort of all pairs detected. But this took 35 years to achieve. But this was an idea. Okay, so this is a detection loophole. So the detection loophole can be eliminated in principle if you detect all pairs. Well, okay, do it. Then there are other loopholes, so there were many discussions on this loophole. So this loophole is a little bit of a crazy loophole, so you may like it or not. It's called, I call it the universal conspiration loopholes, which is to tell that actually there is no true randomness. When you try to switch your thing randomly, there is no randomness. Everything has been written at the beginning of the universe by somebody, who else, I don't know. Everything is determined in advance, and then it cannot be tested, actually. So it's a way to violate Bell's inequalities, but for me, at least, for Alain Aspect also, it's not compatible with physics. If you say that there is no randomness, no free will, nothing, everything is written, okay, but this cannot be tested. So this is a loophole I would sort of remove, where these two are physical loophole, and they can be fixed if you work well enough. Okay, yeah, maybe little pause. Do you have any questions before? I will explain now how the loopholes were fixed, but is it okay for everybody? No questions? Okay, perfect. So yes, so first reason for this loophole, as I said, is that when a photon is emitted, for instance this way, the other one can go any other way. And so it means that you will get a click, but no double click, and so you will miss the pair. So this is this factor here, this epsilon, which makes, or the xi, the angular correlation, which means that you can have many single counts, which don't correspond to double counts, to coincidences. So in order to do better, you should make sure that if a photon goes this way, the other photon goes in a well-defined way. And then you will have both in well-defined direction. So with an atomic source like that, this cannot be done. But this can be done in practice using other methods, and we already heard about parametric down conversion several times, so I tell it again. So in some crystals, which have a chi2 nonlinearity, you may have blue photons, a UV laser, which is split into two photons, which are usually called idler and signal. And the sum of the energy has to be, or the frequencies has to be the energy of the blue photon. And the sum of the K of the wave vectors must also match the UV laser. So it means that if a photon goes this way, for instance, you will know where the other photon go. And so you will have rings, for instance, like that, which are matched between the two photons. So the interesting case is a situation where both photons have the same frequency. So it corresponds to these green rings. And you see that these green rings cross in 2 points, here and there. And in addition, these two photons, for this so-called type 2 phase matching, always have orthogonal polarization. So if you look at this point, for instance, you don't know whether, if you get a photon, you don't know whether it comes from here or from here. But if it comes from here, it's like that. And if it is the other way around, it's like that. So it means that if you take two correlated directions going this way and that way, you will have well-defined angles, because one photon here corresponds to one photon here, but you will have a superposition of polarization, because you don't know which is which, from which ring comes the photon, and then you will have a superposition like that, plus like that, which is what you want. So this is a big advantage of this scheme, contrary to the atomic scheme, is that the direction, the wave vectors are fully correlated. So now if you put two little pinholes here and here, you should get, in principle, only pairs. That is, as soon as you have a photon on one side, you have also a photon on the other side. This is the idea. In practice, it's quite difficult to make work efficiently, because if your hole is too big, for instance, you will lose on the correlation, and if the hole is too small, you will lose on the efficiency. You will lose some pairs. So it took a lot of time to get that to work. So this is, yes, two directions where vertical and horizontal are entangled. Actually, in practice, it was not really done this way, but a similar way. And by using polarized photon and in parametric fluorescence, one can get what is needed. So this was done after many years. It took, as I said, 35 years. So the experiments, there were 4 experiments, actually 3 done in 2015 and 1 done in 2017. 2 of them are with photons, and 2 of them are with spins, because you can also do it with spins. I will tell you a little bit later. So this paper was written by Alain Aspect himself, closing the door on Einstein and Bohr's quantum debate in 2015. So these experiments are convincing in the sense that all what I call reasonable loopholes are sort of fixed. There are good reasons to think that the conditions that I told before are satisfied. So a little bit more about this thing. As I said, two experiments were done with photons and 2 with spins. So the 2 experiments with photons, one was done in Vienna in the group of Anton Zeilinger. So this was done in the basement of Hofburg. So Hofburg is a big imperial castle in Vienna. So this is, there are like bunkers below the castle, and this bunkers there is a hole which is 100 meters long, and they were able to emit photons on both sides. Again, entangled photons from a parametric source with photon counters on both sides. So if you want to detect all photons, you need extremely good photon counters. So in that case, it was a superconducting photon counters. So you see liquid helium, all that kind of thing. And then basically all the conditions I said before were satisfied. The efficiency was very high, both because of the angular correlation and because of these superconducting photon counters. And also the switching was fully random, because it was not oscillating switches as before. It was fully random switching with independent quantum random number generator in order to generate the choice. And the distance was high enough so that there was absolutely, with a significant margin, no way to send message informing one side about the choice on the other side. and Bell's inequalities were violated, etc., as usual. So the same thing was done in Boulder in Colorado. So the shape is a little bit different. It's not an historical castle, it's just a lab. The distances are similar, you see 100 meters, and the technology is very similar actually. And both experiments are photonic experiments. Now the two other ones are nice because they are not done with photons, they are done with spins. So if you do the homework also, if you are able to untangle remotely two spins and make spin measurement, as usual, then you can also violate Bell's inequalities. So these spins in that case were NV center in diamond, so well, I will not tell more details, but basically it's a spin which is embedded in a diamond crystal, and you can remotely untangle these two spins by using light. So you send lights, you make a quantum measurement on a photon, the result is that the two spins are untangled, but they are static, they don't move anymore. So it's quantum memory, untangled quantum memories. Then you can measure Bell's inequalities on that, and again you can violate them. So here you see the distance is a little bit larger, but it also gave a good result. Well, this is a little bit controversial because the statistics were not very good. The number of pairs was extremely small, but still it did work. And there were a fourth experiment, this one, which was done in Munich with atoms, not, now it's a hyperfine structure, it's atom in traps. Again, the atoms are entangled by using photons, then the atoms are stored, then you can measure the correlation between the spins, and it violates Bell's inequalities. So, well, it's sort of fixed. So what can we conclude about that? So you see, with classical physics, the correlation measurements carried out on separated subsystems are explained like twins by genes, common genes, by attributing to each subsystem some properties which are correlated to the other one because they have the same origin, because they were emitted together. If one tries to reproduce quantum correlation using such a model, so it's a classical local realistic model, Bell's inequalities showed that it doesn't work. So you may accept that these properties are non-local, you have some influence, instantaneous influence at the distance, but okay, nobody like that, so if you reject that, then you are sort of stuck to the following conclusion. So quantum mechanics remains in perfect agreement with relativistic causality, but there is a price. It is impossible to attribute a local physical reality to the state of each subsystem. It means when you have your particle here in a box, there is absolutely no way to say, I know the properties of this particle. If you tell that, you contradict Bell's inequalities. So what are these properties? They are joint properties. They are common properties of the pairs. So you can say a lot about that, but it's sort of a non-avoidable consequence of what I have just said. So there is no local physical reality for quantum particles. So it's called quantum non-separability or EPR paradox, as you wish. So it's also called entanglement, obviously, because in order to see this effect, you require entanglement, and it plays an essential role in quantum information, which is what I would like to show now. Okay, make a little stop. Do you have any questions or remarks or whatever? Now, the next part will be what can I do with entanglement? But before telling what can I do with entanglement, I would like to be sure that you did understand entanglement. Don't be shy. Yes?
I have a question. It's not exactly from the lecture you had, but I read before about Bell EPR paradox, and I had a question. When the meter in the middle sends two entangled pairs, two photons, and they entangled, and for example, Alice measures the spin in the X projection, and Bob measures the spin in the Y projection. So we know that because they entangled means that we can tell from Bob can tell what is the spin projection from the Alice. And I have a question, yes, it is impossible in quantum mechanics to measure two projections of spin at once, because It's forbidden by the computational ratio.
But it's not the same. Alice measures one and Bob measures the other one.
What?
Alice measures one and Bob measures another one, so this is fine. We have no problem with that.
But they measure different particles, but
yes.
their projections are entangled.
Yes.
So we can tell exactly what was the projection of the Alice's
yes.
on this axis.
Yes.
But this is. But then
this is another way to tell the same thing as I said, because this is closer to initial EPRID. If I measure that, I shall know on the other side. If I measure something here, I shall know something else on the other side. And these two things on one side are not commuting, so I cannot know them together. It's a I prefer not to tell it this way, but I think it's just another way to tell the same story.
Basically, it means that those operators commute, right?
This one and this one commute. The two here don't commute and the two here don't commute. This is the trick. All Alice measurements commute with all Bob measurements, but Alice has to do two measurements which don't commute, and Bob has to do two measurements which don't commute. So if you put all these things together, you get the violation of Bell's inequalities. It was shown that you need two non-commuting measurements on each side, but obviously one side and the other side do commute because these are different places. It's just locality basically.
Okay. You need to clarify that the angles on each side are between 0 and 45.
Between?
Neither 0 nor 45 are 70 degrees. So the typical angles are degrees.
No, they can be anything. But if you want the violation, you have maybe there is a little drawing here. Yes. So you see, I take the three angle identical, but now you have to make a good choice of this angle. So if you want to get this violation, it's 22.5 degrees. If you make 45 degrees, for instance, it's random and you get no correlation. So you can see it here also. So you see, if you take the good angle, 25.2, you have maximum violation. But if you take this angle, you have no violation. You are within Bell's inequality. So you have to choose properly your measurement direction. Otherwise, you get no violation. In this area, it's the same system, but you don't do the right measurement, and then you get no violation. So you have to optimize, obviously. Is it clear? Other questions? Yes, at the beginning, you really have to realize also that in order to seize your violation, it takes a lot of effort. If you do things wrong, if you don't prepare your entangled set properly, it will not violate. If you take the wrong angle, it will not violate. So there are many reasons for not violating Bell's inequalities. Violating them requires some effort in order to see something interesting. So the correlation, in some people also tell, quantum correlation are stronger than classical correlation. So if you reduce the correlation, you will come back to this thing, which are smaller correlations. So the quantum correlation, in that sense, are larger than classical correlations. Everything crystal clear? Okay? Okay, so let's go on. Okay, so what can we do with that? So many things. So I will start maybe a little bit, little remark. So I spoke about either photons or spin 1/2 particles. So spin 1/2 particle has basically the same properties almost as the polarized photons, because all these systems are two-state quantum systems. So two-level atom is the same. So for a spin, orthogonal states are like that. For a photon, orthogonal states are really orthogonal. For atoms, two states, excited and ground state, for instance, are orthogonal. So all these two-state systems are various implementations of a quantum bit. So all these things are quantum bits. So now it becomes very general. You don't have to worry about spins, photons, etc. If you think in general, all these objects, physical objects, are implementation of a quantum bit. They can be in any state or in any superposition of these states. So the most general state of a qubit is something like that, alpha 0 plus beta 1. It's a quantum superposition of the two logical states, 0 and 1. So 1 can be, for instance, plus for a spin, x for a photon, e for an atom, same for 0. So which results can be found when measuring the qubit's logical state? So this is the first course of quantum mechanics. Well, you can find either, in such a state, you can find either 0 or 1 if you measure the qubit logical state. With which probabilities, you all know that also, is the square modulus of alpha and the square modulus of beta are the probability to find 0 or 1. Now, a little bit more subtle question. What is the difference between the qubit and the random classical bit, which will have the same probabilities of finding either 0 or 1? So what would you answer to this question? Who wants to answer this question? I can say, okay, if I measure 0 or 1, I get 0 or 1 with probability modulus square of alpha, modulus square of beta. But it's not a random bit. It would be coin tossing. But it's a qubit. It's not a classical bit. So what is the difference between the qubit and a classical bit? Don't tell it's a superposition. Okay, well, yes, it's a superposition. But what does that mean?
There is a phase.
Sorry?
There is a phase.
There is a phase, but okay, and then?
You can observe some interference.
Be more specific. You know, in many talks, people tell, okay, this is a quantum superposition, so what does that mean? It means it's both 0 and 1. So while you are both 0 and 1, what does that mean? It means basically nothing. Sorry?
If you consider this as a vector, then it has infinite directions.
Yes, sorry, it's...
It has infinite number of directions.
Uh-huh.
If you consider it as a vector.
Yes.
So that's the difference. And the random bit has only two different directions.
Yes, but what do you get with this direction?
Like Bloch sphere.
Yes, it's Bloch sphere. It's my next slide, but I would like more physics. What can you do with this qubit you cannot do with a random bit? Yes. Oh, yeah, well. They should answer. So who to answer?
You can choose bias. In this bias, it will be always 1.
Ah, yes, that's right. This is the point. So you can choose, it is random, it sounds random, but by definition for, as you say, with the Bloch sphere, so this is a Bloch sphere. So if you take the most general qubit, it can be written like that, and as you probably know, it's the spin operator can be expressed as a function of Pauli matrices, and basically it corresponds to plus along a direction u means that you will find with certainty the result plus if you measure the spin along direction u. And the other possibility is minus. But now if you look to this state, it's exactly the same as this one. So it means that whatever superposition you have, oops, sorry, you will always find a vector u where the result is certain. You get plus for sure. So actually, there is a certainty which is hidden in a qubit. A qubit sounds random, but actually it's not that random. Just the contrary. It's a certain result, a result that you can have with certainty, provided that you choose a good direction. And this is what a qubit is really telling. Now, if you make it wrong, you get you get anything. But basically, a qubit contains a certainty. And it makes it completely different, obviously, from a classical random bit. Okay, so now you can also manipulate your qubit. You can put a B field, for instance, if it is a spin, you have an Hamiltonian like that. So it means that if you have a plus along this direction, for instance, if you put a B field and it is a spin, it will precess, that is, it will move along this red, this pink circle. And so if you apply your B field during a given time, you can go from here to any point here. And if you can go here, you just put the appropriate magnetic field. So it's, you can rotate your, and then get U as you want, any point on the sphere. So this is called a single qubit gates. And basically, it allows you to drive your qubit in any pure state, in any state of this form, for any U on the sphere. Okay, so this is well known. Now another question is, how do you measure a qubit? So it's again spin 1/2 photons atom. So there are sort of rude measurements and not rude measurements. So the rude measurement is called direct measurement process. So for a spin 1/2, you just send it to a Stern-Gerlach magnet, then you get a space-size splitting of your thing, and you say it's plus and it's minus. And then your qubit is killed, basically, in this process. For a photon is a polarizer, you get a click, so this is what I was doing in my experiment. This measurement demolishes the qubit, you basically kill it, you destroy it. So it's not very nice, because if you make a lot of effort to get qubits, you would like to be able to reuse them. And therefore, you would like able to measure them without demolishing them. So this is called an indirect measurement process. And the trick here is to read the state of the qubit by coupling it to another qubit. Then one can realize an ideal measurement, that is, one can actually prepare the signal qubit, so interesting one, in a given state. And this is called the quantum non-demolition measurement. So this was introduced by Braginsky and Khalili. I remember visiting Moscow State University with Braginsky many years ago, in the 90s, I think. This was a great experience. I went to the basement with a little sphere, maybe you know that. Okay, so these quantum non-demolition measurements are, I think, a very fruitful concept, which were introduced by Vladimir Braginsky. So there is a misunderstanding with non-demolition. So non-demolition does not mean that it does not change the quantum state. When you do a quantum measurement, you always change the quantum state unless it is an eigenstate of what you are measuring. This is well known. So a QND measurement, the system is changed unless it's an eigenstate. But the point is that the system is still there and you know its state. So if it was not if it is an eigenstate, you will just keep it and find again and again, and it's the certainty we said before. If it is not an eigenstate, you will put it in an eigenstate and then keep it in that eigenstate. And this is what is called quantum non-demolition measurement. It's not the fact that you are, some people tell, oh, it's stupid to speak about quantum non-demolition measurements because you always change the state when you do the measurement. Okay, okay, but this is not the point. The point is that you keep your qubit in a non-state. Okay, so how do we do a QND measurement? So there are many, many ways. I published many papers on that. So typically, a simple way to do it, if you have let's say a spin, a qubit A, then you want to establish a coupling between, for instance, the spin A and another spin B during a time tau, and you will basically transfer the information from A to B. And then you will read out B and get the result on A. So you can do that if you, for instance, if you have two spins, you design an Hamiltonian like that. You see it's a product of sigma Z for A and sigma X for B. And this will basically transfer the information from A to B. So, for instance, if I start, A can be initially in the state plus or minus along A. B, it's a given state, let's say By, so this is this one. And then after the interaction, I will get plus plus here and minus minus here. So you see the B has changed. If it was plus, it remained plus. If it was minus, it became minus. So in the homework, you can do this calculation. I will not do it again now, but if you have any doubts, all the details are in the homework, and if you are not able to do it, ask me. I have the slides with the correction. So let's admit that. So did I copy the state of my qubit? When I do that, you see plus, you have plus, minus, plus, plus, and then now you have plus, minus, plus, minus. Did I copy the state of the qubit? Yes and or no?
You copied these two states already.
Sorry?
You copied these two states already, but only them.
Yes, so I copied, yes, you are right. So my point is that I indeed copied in a given basis. But the point is that, I will give more details here. So this is for this basis, let's say, Z for plus or minus along Z. Now if I take an arbitrary state from my first qubit, something like that, again, alpha plus beta, then this one is By, you see that the result of my little coupling is to prepare this state. So what is this state? This is just an EPR entangled state. This is why where I wanted to come. And if I, now on this state, I measure qubit B, I will find plus with probability modulus of square of alpha, and this one with modulus square of beta. So you see that by measuring the qubit B, I will get exactly the same thing as quantum mechanics tell initially for this state. So this is why it is called an indirect measurement. For each, the probability are the same, the results are the same, and after the measurement of B, I did not touch A, the result of the qubit A is perfectly known after the measurement. So it's so-called reduction of the wave packet, but it's just entanglement. I'm just exploiting the entanglement just as before. So this is an indirect measurement, which is a QMD measurement, because you see, if I am in eigenstate of here plus A, I remain there. Here I also remain there. Otherwise, I project, and I get new eigenstate. And if I repeat, I will get again the same. Okay, so about this copying, so it's fundamental. So here it looks like copying, but it is copying in a given basis, which is the Z basis. What is impossible to do is this thing. If I take my qubit, which is this, there is no way, quantum mechanics forbids, to change this into that. So this is a so-called no-cloning theorem. It's impossible, if you have an arbitrary state of a qubit, to copy this arbitrary state on another qubit. This would violate Heisenberg relation and everything. So it's a little proof. Who does not know that? Okay, so everybody knows that. Perfect. If you don't know that, come and I will show you the proof. I have that on my computer. It's just more slides. Okay, so this is a no-cloning theorem. So you should be, the main point to remember here is that it looks like copying, but it's not copying. It's just entangling. So what I'm doing there is I entangle my A qubit with a B qubit. I get the measurement that I want to go, but it's not copying, it is entangling. Okay, so now if it is entangling, let's entangle. So one entangle many things with many things. So you see what I did here was, this thing. So you can look at this thing that as a change of the state of qubit B as a function of the state of qubit A. So now it's a logical operation. And this logical operation is just called a CNOT gate, control NOT. So it's basically the idea that if I start from my two qubits in state 0, 0, so if the first qubit is 0, the second one remains 0. If the first qubit is 1, then I swap the second one, and it gets to 1. So generally, one can define a CNOT control NOT gate, which does the following. 0, 0 remains 0, 0, 0. So it means that if I don't change the first qubit, if the first qubit is 0, I don't change the second qubit. If the first qubit is 1, I swap the second one. So this logical gate, if you combine this logical gate plus the rotation on the Bloch sphere, I already said before, you have what is called a universal set of quantum gates, and then you can do any kind of quantum calculations. So a little question, for instance, so you remember, so I did, when I was a PhD, I did a huge effort to prepare this state, the entangled state, it's an EPR state. So now I ask you, how would I give you that, you want that, what to do? Everybody should know that, but okay. Think a little bit if you don't know. What is a simple quantum calculation which makes me, which allows me to change this into that?
You should use Hadamard gate on the first qubit and then CNOT.
Sorry?
You should use Hadamard gate on the first qubit,
Okay.
and then use it as a control for the second one.
Okay, but I did not define Hadamard gate, so can you define Hadamard gate?
It's just making
On the,
superposition of.
yeah, on the Bloch sphere,
It's changing the direction.
pi over 2 on the Bloch sphere. So I take my qubit, I put it there, pi over 2, okay, so, okay, you got it? But you knew it before? Oh, okay. So, okay, so this was super well known, obviously. So if you want to prepare such an entangled state, so you start from here, so you first do, so let's say it's 0 is here. So if I rotate on the Bloch sphere to the equator, I will prepare this quantum superposition for the first qubit, and then I apply a CNOT gate between from the first to the second one. So here the second one remains 0, and here the second one goes to 1. And now you see it's an entangled state. So you see, if you have rotation of a qubit is pretty easy. If you have a CNOT gate, you can immediately prepare entangled state, violate Bell's inequality, etc. So any kind of quantum computer, if it is a decent one, will immediately violate Bell's inequalities because it's a sort of the most basic calculation you can do. So, okay, it is 35 years later, I remind, but still it's interesting. And this was done with trapped ion, for instance, in Innsbruck, in the Rayner's-Black experiment. They did that many times. So now one may wonder, okay, so I started from this one, but there are many other ones. There are also 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, 1. So let's put all of them. Then if I start from this 4 orthogonal states, so these are, it's a basis of for 2 qubits, then I go to this by doing always the same thing. So you see, I always do the same thing, that is Hadamard plus C0. And then I get, it's a unitary transform, and then I get 4 orthogonal states, which are called Bell states, which are 4 orthogonal states, entangled orthogonal states. So it's a new basis of the thing, also it can be done automatically, starting from any of these two. Also what is very interesting, it's a unitary transform, so it's reversible. So now you can make a so-called Bell state measurement, which is measuring in this basis. So if you want to know in which of these states you are, so it's not obvious to distinguish this one and this one. So the simplest way is just to run the thing the other way. Since it's unitary, it can be run the other way. So you disentangle first, and then you go back to this set. And depending on the fact that you get this or this or this or this, you know that initially you were this and this and this is called a Bell state measurement. And Bell state measurements are very useful for what? For many things, but among many things, if I tell you, I give you Bell state measurement, what will you do? Quantum teleportation, yes. Quantum teleportation is the most famous protocol which can be done by using this. But I will give you other examples. Okay, so now, obviously, this is an entangling operation. So I entangle this thing and I entangle this thing. I get entangled state. Now, there is this cat story. We already heard about cat. So the idea is simple, that if you start from this qubit state, you can entangle, it's a meter, so you get this entangled state. This is just what I said before. And this is proven if the M here is microscopic, just another qubit. But now I can repeat it many times, and M can become macroscopic, a big thing, a cat. And so, well, you know Schrödinger's cat story with, I will not tell it again, with the poisons, radioactive stuff. But if you just chain this entanglement operation, you end up with something which is a quantum, just like that. You see, it's no different. But this M, instead of being another qubit, is now a cat, and the cat may be dead or alive. So this sounds strange, because clearly this is true. This can even be reversed. It's a reversible thing. Here, it's a little bit harder to reverse. It would mean also that I can define a dead plus alive and dead minus alive, and that they are orthogonal states. Well, I'm not so sure. So this cannot be observed, clearly. Why? So everybody has its own opinion why. So it's a famous transition. So this is perfectly legal. At some point, it stops being legal because, okay, we move to the macroscopic world, and nobody will tell that, okay, then you know the story. If you are in such a state, what kills the cat is when you open the box, but no, it's stupid. The cat is either dead or alive before you open the box. Everybody knows that. So what's the trick? What's the trick? Huh?
The bottle with the acid dust measurement.
Sorry?
I mean, the measurement happens, the collapse of the wave function happens when the bottle with the acid falls on the floor.
Are you sure it's the bottle and it's not the radioactive decay?
Yeah, right away.
Yeah, but it's radioactive decay. It's very quantum, and
Here's
then
where the measurement happens, and then the cat is alive or dead. It's just the usual probabilities, classical probabilities.
yeah, I agree with the conclusion, but telling where it happens is not so clear. You know, it's a chain. You see, it's because you have the radioactive decay. Okay.
Because you're looking at the cat only, but you need a tangling measurement of cat and anatomy. Kind of like the previous slides.
Little bit, yes, we get close. Okay, there are many explanations, and myself, I have several ones. So I will give you one, which is a standard one that everybody knows. Okay, so what's happened? Yes, okay. So what happens? So the trick, according to standard wisdom, and this is very, so if it goes up, when the size of the system becomes macroscopic, then it's very difficult that it gets coupled to the outside world. So basically you have this growing entanglement, and then you will get a huge entangled set which goes to the walls, and then it may go even through the walls, and you will get anywhere very big entanglement. Now, if you look at the cat is a subpart of this entanglement. And if you remember my Bell state story, if I look only at one photon, it's a random photon, and it's completely random, and it's classically random. So it's like coin tossing. So it means you can think about anything about a huge, gigantic entangled state. If you take a subpart of this state, what you will get looks like classical probabilities. So, okay, this is sort of a shortcut, but this is fine, I think. Linear superposition becomes a statistical mixture simply because you ignore part of the system. So people say often the environment measures the system. And then the interaction determines that the good basis is dead or alive. It's not dead plus alive and dead minus alive. And then you get basically classical probability. So it's some people call it loss of information. It's because you cannot keep track to all the information. You make a partial trace, and then you get randomness, classical randomness. You may like it or not like it. It's a standard explanation. We may discuss more if you want. So this is called decoherence theory. Everybody more or less agrees on that? Okay, so how much time do I have left? Yes, I have. Okay, so now let's speak a little bit about quantum computing. So quantum computing, so the idea is to make computation, as you know, by using this elementary set of gates. So you have your qubits, you can rotate it arbitrarily, and you can do CNOT gates, and then you can do any kind of algorithm, Shor's algorithm, Grover's algorithm. I will not give more details. But I would rather try to explain whether it can work and how it may work, etc. So if you want to do quantum computing, you have to chain many elementary entangling, mostly entangling logical operation. So decoherence will work against this chaining, just like for the cat. That is, if you have any information which escapes to the environment, then your entangled state will be not the one you believe, it will be a bigger thing, and what will remain to you will be classical randomness. So one has absolutely to avoid that, to avoid this leak of information, which destroys quantum coherence and makes the probability classical. So there is a trick to do that, which is called quantum error correcting codes, and quantum error correcting codes are using entanglement, obviously. So I will just, in 2 slides, fly over quantum error correcting code because it's a huge subject. So a way to tell it is the following. If you have a qubit, what may happen to your qubit is sort of a unitary transform, which may be random or not random, which may be anything. But any unitary operator on a qubit can be written like that. So it's a sum of 4 matrices. This matrix, so this is normalization. This is unity, so nothing happened. You see this is this inverse 0 and 1, so it's so-called a bit error, and this is a Pauli matrix sigma x. This one changes the sign of 0 and 1, of 0 with respect to 1, so it's called a phase error, it's a sigma z. And this one, sigma y, is a product of these two, so it's both a bit and phase error. And that's all. That's all may happen to a qubit. This is fantastic. Everything can be reduced to one of these 4 errors. So if you know which error happens, well, you can correct it. And if you, for instance, if you imagine a little rotation, so it looks more complicated than that. But actually, if you know one of these, you project back to that, and then you can sort of split the space of the states of your qubit in a way which defines these 4 errors. So in some sense, for a qubit, errors are quantized among 4 possibilities. And if you know which one happens, you can correct. And this is a basic idea of quantum error correcting codes. So what you have to do is, so you take your qubit, it will entangle with environment, so you will get something like that. So it should remind you of quantum teleportation if you do that. Nothing happened, and then it's entangled with something which says nothing happened. Or you swap the bits, you invert 0 and 1, so this is a bit error. Or you change the sign, which is a phase error. Or you change the sign and swap the bit, and it's a bit and phase error. So in general, you don't know this stuff. They may be not normalized, not orthogonal, there may be any kind of garbage, and then your qubit is killed. Now, how do you get back your qubit? All the trick is to be able to identify in which of these 4 states your environment is. And if you can do that, well, if you know you are here, so you are safe, nothing happens. If you know you are here, you just swap the qubit, and you get back to the good result. You correct the error. So the main idea is that qubits should be encoded in such a way that there is some information available in the environment, which is called a syndrome, which can be measured, and on ancilla qubits, which are entangled with your interesting qubit, in order to make these 4 states orthogonal. That is, only one of these possibilities happens, and if you know which one, you can correct. So by reading the syndrome in the environment, the encoded qubit is exactly as before. It's projected on a known state, like in my QND measurement before. And if you know which state you are, you can correct it. So you say, but if you know you cannot copy, you cannot clone, you cannot whatever. But you see that in this operation, you don't know anything on your qubit, which is absolutely fundamental. Knowing something about your qubit would be knowing A and B. But here I never know A and B. I just swap the bit, swap the sign, or swap both. It does not change A and B, and I never know them. So I can correct something I cannot know and I cannot copy, which is the magic of quantum error correcting codes, but well, in principle it works. So you see, it's using entanglement to get rid of entanglement. By getting entangled with something you know, you can avoid the effect of entanglement with something you don't know. This is the trick. So good entanglement with controlled encoded and ancilla qubits protects against bad entanglement with uncontrolled entanglement. It's like life. There are good things and bad things in life. Entanglement is the same. You have to use it properly. Okay, so it's a super. My main message here, you cannot understand quantum error correcting codes from this very, very simple view, but I just want to point out that entanglement is absolutely essential. It's, since the beginning, it's all based on entanglement, and this is the same idea which is exploited here. Okay, so I think I'm more or less to the end. We may have a little time for questions, yes. So the conclusion for this thing is that you see, when you have many qubits, if they get entangled with the environment, basically this will kill your qubit. This will be decoherence. So the trick of error correcting codes is that you create a little cloud here by entangling the qubit between themselves. These are the so-called quantum codes, and with ancilla, which allows you to extract the information to know on which part of you are, and then it allows you to protect the qubits. So all this is based on entanglement. So this was my main message in some sense. I started from Foundations of Quantum Mechanics, CPR Bell. Quantum measurements, Braginski and company, are based on entanglement. Quantum logical gates and computing, their main advantage is to be entangling gates. And if you want to use error correcting codes, you have to intensively use entanglement. Okay, so I said at the beginning that Einstein objections were fruitful. Actually, they are fruitful. But Einstein did not like it. But maybe he did not like it because he felt it was going too far from classical physics. So he allowed us to understand how strange quantum physics is. But maybe now we know, and we are able to use it and understand it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. So before we start the questions, so let me remind that about 1 hour ago, we have sent all of you homework prepared by me, where those questions are listed. Okay? So you will.
So homework are only the questions. The solutions are here, but I will not show you the solutions unless you ask.
Okay, so it's time for the questions. Any questions?
About quantum computing, a few slides ago.
Which one?
Next.
Next.
This one. Could you please clarify what is CX, CY, and CZ coefficients?
This?
It's from? No.
This coefficient.
Yes.
Well, it's basically if you have a unitary matrix, you can write it this way.
I see.
It's because these 4 matrices are a basis for unitary matrices. You see, all these 3 matrices are polymatrices. They are both Hermitians and unitaries, and you can write any unitary matrix under this form.
I just wonder, what do you think about nowadays attempts to expand variable theory? I mean, which are made by serious people, by serious scientists, and try to go back.
Expand in which direction?
I don't know.
Well, yes. So for instance, there is a well-known hidden variable theory, which is de Broglie-Bohm theory, which it's sort of working. It's mathematically equivalent to quantum mechanics. So and there are hidden variables, but there are non-local hidden variables. So in de Broglie-Bohm theory, there are explicitly instantaneous influences. It does not violate relativity, it does not allow you to send faster than light messages, but there is an explicit non-locality. So some people like it, I don't like it at all, and there are many debates, and so far, since there are no experimental check against the Broglie. So I have a good friend who is who likes de Broglie-Bohm very well. So we had many arguments, and we could never convince each other about nothing. So if you like de Broglie, okay, that's up to you. I find the price, it generates a lot of complications without any advantage for me. But for my friend, it's interesting. So, well, that's the foundations of quantum mechanics. Yes.
No, but actually in Wikipedia you can find that non-locality, which is typical for quantum mechanics, is not is not acknowledged in quantum field theory, because they very like that everything has some reasons and so on, and
well.
in this way also.
No, but it's different. There is a confusion you should absolutely avoid, which is to mix up quantum non-locality and relativistic causality. Relativistic causality is all the things we can deduce from special relativity about the impossibility to go faster, transmit messages faster than light, etc. And quantum mechanics fully agrees with that. Non-locality, quantum non-locality, all this Bell's inequality violation, is really strange in the sense that it sounds non-local, but for me, it's almost more non-classical than non-local. It's what fails is, people usually tell, what fails is local realism. Okay, but what is local realism? So if you take local as relativistic locality, it certainly does not fail. It's still fact. So if you take realism, what do you mean by realism? So what I tell is that if you take realism as classical realism, which is the idea that particles carry their own properties, this does fail. So in some sense, it's a classical view of the world which fails. Classical view being that you can define properties which belong to objects. In quantum mechanics, properties don't belong to objects. Actually, they belong to objects within context, which is my own view of this thing. But there are, everybody agrees on how to use quantum mechanics, and everybody disagrees about what quantum mechanics means. I have another talk on that if you want, but another time.
I had a question. If an atom interacts with an electromagnetic field, then there's like an entanglement between the state of the atom and the state of the field. And if we measure the field,
Yes.
then is it a quantum non-demolition measurement?
Well, it depends how you perform it, but yes, it can be.
I mean, if for example an atom interacts with a waveguide and they measure a voltage in this waveguide.
For example, analog digital.
You know, in my definition of quantum measurements, you need an Hamiltonian, and there are some conditions for this Hamiltonian to be QND, which was said by Braginski already. Now, you have to be your question is sort of too general. Certainly, by making interaction between, you take for instance Haroche experiment with microwave fields in cavities. He sends atoms, so he can do QND measurement of photons in the cavity by reading the atoms, because he entangles the photon field with the atoms. Then he measures the atom E and G. It gives one bit, and then he repeats the experiment. He gets many bits from many atoms, and from that he can count the photons in the cavity in a non-destructive way. So you see, it's a QND measurement of the field by using many atoms and entanglement. And so there is no problem with that. If you have entangled two quantum systems and measure one of them, which is in Haroche experiment, you measure the atom and you get information of the field, this is fine. You can certainly do the other way around. That is using the field to get information on atoms, which is also possible. You know, basically, QND measurement are entanglement plus readout of the ancilla. And if you can do that with some reasonable property on the Hamiltonian, you can do it. And in quantum computing, it's sort of super basic. It's the thing you are doing all the time.
If there is no question, thank Philip again.